right, Sid,
Oh, okay.
take it away.
My name's Sid Burks. I've been a member of this chapter on and off, from back when they were Bermuda Dunes. And I've got a strong interest in military, desert, and aviation history. And when I found out that the Navy actually trained seaplane pilots at the Salton Sea, I got real interested in that and researched it. And then Patrick, if you know Patrick, asked me to give a presentation of the Old Bulls pilots about 10 years ago. And that started me off on a hobby of doing research on different aviation, military, desert history related topics, and then giving presentations to any group that was interested. So I think I've talked about every group in the valley, from Patton Museum to the Palm Springs Museum to Old Bull Pilots to EAA. And today I want to talk about the PBY. Can we close that door there, please?
Yeah, I was gonna say that. If it gets warm, we can also turn that AC on if we need to.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Can you turn the front lights off?
That might help too.
The door helps.
Ah, perfect, nice.
So this is the
I
PBY.
know, that thing's gonna be anyway.
Yeah. This is the PBYs that the airmen have, and that's flying it over the Salton Sea.
Oh, that thing is in offerings?
Yeah, it's over at the Air Museum,
Oh, wow.
that particular airplane. Are you doing restoration work on it?
They are, but it's not gonna fly.
Yeah, it's gonna be a static display.
They're gonna come by, they wanna soda blast it, I think, in the next few weeks, and then they're gonna be painted.
The PBYs, after the war, a lot of them were used as fire bombers. And that produced a lot of corrosion. And that's what happened to this thing. It was used as a fire bomber, and now it's converted to be airworthy.
Good.
You got it? Good. Oh, couple, I turned it on, wouldn't it? Okay, so PBY was started in the early 30s, and by 1939 it was considered to be obsolete. But it did so many different things so well that it stayed into continuous production throughout the war. There were over 3,200 of them made. They were built in 3 different countries, and they were flown by 11 different countries. It was a PBY that found the German battleship Bismarck, and then notified the Royal Fleet, and then they sunk it. It was also made the first aerial attack of World War II. It was a PBY that spotted the midget submarine trying to sneak into Pearl Harbor, and it actually dropped a depth charge and then dropped smoke bombs so the destroyer Ward could put a hole in it and sink it. That's another topic, by the way. It discovered 2 of the Japanese. Come on in. Come on in. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Robbie. That's David, he's our scholarship applicant.
All right.
Rob's the guy, what's that guy?
So it was a PBY that discovered 2 different elements of the Japanese fleet at Midway and warned the American fleet. And, you know, who knows, it might have made a difference in who won Midway. There's also one PBY that landed 4 times under fire to rescue 15 Army Air Force flyers, and the pilot got the Medal of Honor for that deed. Also, if you know the history of the USS Indianapolis, when it was sunk by Japanese submarine, it was a PBY that pulled 56 men out of the water, saved their lives. So, P stands for patrol plane, B stands for bomber, and Y stands for Consolidated Aircraft.
Wow.
Well, how do you get Y out of Consolidated Aircraft? Well, unfortunately, Curtiss Aircraft already had C, so the next identifier that was up was Y. So Consolidated became, the Navy identified as Y. And then, remember, before the radar, the Navy needed some way to look over the horizon to see if the enemy was there. So the patrol planes would actually, they call it scouting. They would do 2 types of scouting. They would look over the horizon for the fleet, make sure where the enemy was, and then they'd actually go out and look for the enemy. So that was the scouting part of it. The PBY could drop 2,000 pounds worth of bombs, two 500-pound bombs under each wing. Really wasn't very successful as a bomber, with a couple exceptions that we'll talk about. But when it came out, it was actually fitted with a Norden bomb sight. And the bombardier would have lay on his belly between the two pilots and, you know, fix the Norden bomb sight. But it was really no good at high altitude bombing, so they did away with the bomb sight and they used it for low altitude bombing. Like I said, we'll talk more about that later. Consolidated Aircraft was originally located in upstate New York in Buffalo, and they had a little problem in the wintertime. When they built an airplane, they'd have to disassemble it, put it on a seaplane. They'd have to disassemble it, put it on a flat railroad car and ship it somewhere where the water wasn't frozen. So they decided to heck with that, and they moved to sunny San Diego. Here's a picture of the seaplane factory in San Diego. It was right by Lindbergh Field. And here's a PBY taxiing out in front of the San Diego Civic Building.
Wow.
This is the Consolidated Aircraft signage.
Sorry, everyone, I'm a bit late.
Tell us who you are.
I'm sorry?
Tell us who you are.
Oh, my name's Julian, guys. I've been here 2 meetings already, so this is my third one.
Christian Sheriff.
Right.
Come on up, pull up a chair.
I grew up in San Diego, and I remember seeing this Consolidated Aircraft sign kind of fading away on some buildings. But the history is that Consolidated Aircraft merged with Vultee Aircraft up in Downey. And so for a while it was Consolidated Vultee Aircraft. And that got too much of a mouthful, so it got shortened to Convair. And my dad actually worked for Convair when he got out of the Navy. Here's a picture of the PBY factory. By the way, if you have any questions, be sure to ask them. You don't have to wait till the end. I love this picture. This is a pre-war picture of PBY flying over San Diego. Like I told you, I grew up in San Diego. This is San Diego High School. It's better known as the Old Gray Castle. This was Navy Hospital. This was Balboa Park. That's the Ford Rotunda. This is the Ford Rotunda, which is the San Diego Aerospace Museum today. This is the Laurel Street Bridge. At that time, they didn't have a fence on it, and people would jump off of it when they got just depressed. And then, of course, here's all the bell towers in Balboa Park.
Wow, beautiful.
But this is a flying boat. It has a hull on it like a boat. It can only land and take off in the water. So we're going to talk about flying boat first and then amphibians later. So development. This is the original genesis of the PBY. This was called the Admiral. It was actually Consolidated built it as a prototype for a Navy contract. They didn't get the contract, so they decided to go into, hey, Doug the pilot. So they made it into an airliner. So it was one of the first successful seaplane airliners. You got to remember that before the war, there's very few hard surface runways. So if you're going to have a big airplane, it's going to be a seaplane, okay? Because most of the runways were dirt, and most of them were short. So if you had any kind of a big liner, commercial airliner, it's going to be a seaplane. And think about the Pan Am Clippers and all that.
Just a comment.
Unique thing about, do you have a question?
Well, no, Chris, I was gonna say about the Navy, you're right about before the war, there was very few runways, stuff like that. It's like one of the most famous planes in World War II is the Spitfire. It was built by a company called Supermarine. Why was it Supermarine? Because most of the planes landed on water before the war.
Yeah. So the unique thing about the PBY is that the float, the stabilizer float, folded back up into the wing and became part of the airfoil and actually added lift. And the floats on a seaplane created a tremendous amount of drag because you got that big float hanging out in the wind. You got all those bracings and struts and everything. But the PBY could pull that thing back up and eliminated all the drag. So it really contributed to the range and the efficiency.
When was it designed?
Pardon me?
What year was it designed?
In, well, early 30s.
Wow.
Yeah. So here you see a PBY with the float retracted, and you can see it's actually becomes the wingtip and part of the airfoil. And here it's getting ready to land, the floats are lowered, it lands, and then it can pull it back up again when it's ready to take off. They're electrical, but there was a mechanical backup. And I never thought about this till I was in a PBY and I happened to see this thing. I go, oh, that makes sense. You know, if you lose electrical power, you can crank that sucker up and down. So it started off with a PBY-1, which was the original in the series. And what they would do, they'd build 50 or 60 of them, sell them to the Navy. The Navy'd fly them for a while, and they'd say, well, we like this and we don't like that. And then they'd build the next one, so in this case PBY-2, build 50 or 60 of them. And they did that all the way up through PBY-4. And then just before the war, they got it all right, and they came up with the PBY-5 flying boat. So almost all the PBYs that were built were either 5s or 5As, and we'll talk about the difference. But once again, this is a flying boat. This is a hull. With the start of the PBY-5, they built the iconic blisters in them right here. Before that, there was a sliding window where you could stick a machine gun out. But this one had the blisters, and the blisters actually became a really good way to get in and out of the airplane when it was on the water. So the problem was, if you wanted to get the thing up on land, you had to put beaching gear on it. So there's two main gears, and then there was a tail wheel. And some sailors would swim out in their swimsuits and put the beaching gear on the airplane, and then they'd pull it up on a ramp with a tug or a truck or something. And this is at the Salton Sea. They're actually pulling the seaplane up on the ramp. Now the seaplane tenders had a big crane, and there was a hook on the top of the plane. They just lift the plane out of the water, bring it over, and lay it down on the boat when they needed to maintain them. So then later on, they came up with the PBA-5A amphibian, and you see it had a nose gear here that retracted, and these watertight doors would close on it. And then the main gears would fold back up into the fuselage, but they were exposed to the water, so I imagine they had to repack those wheel bearings quite often. This is a Coast Guard PBY. So the Coast Guards and the Navy both operated PBYs. This is at the Salton Sea. This is an amphibian. You can tell by the landing gear. You can see this Coast Guard officer is wearing a summer uniform. And it's a little hard to see, but there's a window right there. The flight engineer actually set up in a pylon on like a hanging trapeze seat and operated most of the controls for the airplane, because the pilots were supposed to be observing. So when these things were converted to civilian use, they did two things. First of all, they did away with the flight engineer's position. They ran all the controls through the pilot seat. And then this is the turret for the machine gun. But look at how it obstructs the forward view of the pilot.
Yeah.
So the first two things they did was get rid of the flight engineer and take the turret off, so that the pilots had a better view. So there's some variants. This gets a little confusing. The PBY was nicknamed Catalina, and some people attribute that to the British, but it was actually Consolidated that came up with that nickname. But it was a nickname, it wasn't an official designation. But later, some of the PBYs that were built in Canada were actually designated Catalinas. That was their actual official name, it wasn't a nickname.
Did it have anything to do with the island of Catalina?
Yeah. And also, some of the ones that were made in Canada were called Cansos. So you had Catalinas, you had Cansos, and you had PBYs. And then you also had a PBN, a Nomad, was built at the end of the war. This was actually built by the Navy at the Naval Aircraft Factory in, I think it was in Pittsburgh. And the Navy had come up with a list of improvements they wanted to make on it, but there was so much demand for the PB5 and the PB5A that they couldn't take it out of production long enough to make the changes. So the Navy said, okay, we'll build it ourselves. So they built a few PBN Nomads at the end of the war. They were flying boats. Yes, sir.
The Buffalo Airways, I don't know if you guys ever watched that on YouTube. The Buffalo, they go up the McKinsey Valley, and it's really north in Canada. And Buffalo Joe, he just, who owns that Airways, he just went up to get a CANSO. So if you look up on YouTube, Buffalo Airways, it's a massive, all kinds of videos. And they're flying old DC-3s, and and unbelievable what they get into. Of course, they have a lot of engine emergencies all the time, to create the interest. But,
Thank you.
yeah.
So PBY had some creature comforts. It had 4 bunks, and I think you could convert into 6 if you needed them. The pilots had first dibs on the bunks because these things had a range of 3,000 miles. They could stay up 24 hours. So some of the pilot had to grab a little rest once in a while. But the rest of the crew could use the bunks if the pilots weren't using them. They had a galley with an electric stove, and sometimes the fighter jocks would fly circles around them to make fun of them. And they'd hold up a cup of coffee in the window or a steak and say, huh, don't you wish? I had a big coffee urn, because as you know, the Navy runs on coffee. When I was teaching high school, the custodians were all retired Navy chiefs from San Diego, and they had a coffee that was they would sell coffee at night to the adult school, and they'd use that to buy floor buffers and stuff. That you could put your spoon in that cup of coffee and it would stand up by itself. And they had a head, sort of. It was actually a 5-gallon can with a seat on it. It was a chemical toilet. So armaments, they had bombs, they could have depth charge, torpedoes, and 30 and 50 caliber machine guns. They start off the first of the war with 30 calibers, and by the end of the war, they're all 50 calibers. So, anybody ever been to Pensacola and gone to the National Naval Aviation Museum? You really should do it. I mean, that is just an incredible museum. They have a PBY there that the pilot taxied it into a building, and they let it set for a long time, and then somebody said, let's make a cutaway of this thing. And so they have 2 PBYs there. One is the last surviving flying boat, and it's in pristine condition, and the other one is this cutaway you see right here. And they have dummies in there dressed up to play the part. So originally, this is the first turret with a 30 and a 50 caliber single machine gun mounted in it. Anybody want to guess what this is? That's a bombardier's window. And then when they have like a Venetian blind, they come up over it to keep the water off of it when they made water landings. And then later on, they came up with what's called an eyeball turret, which is a big improvement because it provided more protection for the gunner. In this case, it's a dual. It's got 250 calibers.
So the gunner is out in the slipstream?
Pardon me?
The gunner is out in the slipstream?
Pretty much in the old turret.
Wow.
And if you go to it used to be called the PBY Museum. Now I think they call it the Western Naval some museum. It's up on Whidbey Island. They've operated a lot of PBYs out of Whidbey. There's actually a turret. You get in it, and then by doing this, you can do this. And it's pretty ingenious. And here's a gunner getting up into the blister. Look at this kid. He doesn't look old enough to shave. I bet he weighs 125 pounds. But he's got his pea shooter 30 caliber with him. Later on, I went to the 50 caliber, and you can see the, oops, go back. You can see the mount here. There was a problem.
That's a 30.
There's a 30? Okay. There's a problem. The canister for the ammo would run out, and the gunner would have to stop, go back and get another canister off a rack on the wall and load it up. Well, the enemy fighter pilots cued in on this, so they'd wait for the guy to run out of ammunition, then they'd make their run. But later on, they had a continuous feed. And in the back, they had what was called a tunnel gun. It was actually a ventral. This is kind of a hatch in the back of the plane. And so they go back there and mount another gun to keep anybody from sneaking up from below and behind. because the PBY has great visibility, but not looking backwards or looking down from the back. So, the missions of the PBY, they evolved during the war. They started off with a long-range patrol, like we talked about, but eventually there was enough hard surface runways that land-based bombers could do the job more efficiently. So they were the anti-submarine warfare, some bombing and harassment, search and rescue missions, those were called Dumbo. And then towards the end of the war, they were used pretty much for moving men and materials around.
Why did they call it Dumbo?
The Disney character, the elephant, that was sort of the Dumbo the elephant. They decided that stood for search and rescue. You know, everybody had to have a Disney character. Yeah. So, like I said, they had almost 3,000 mile range. It depends how it's configured. It had a full crew and few armament, less range. So when they were on scouting missions, they had minimal crew, minimal armament. They also did coastal patrols up and down the coast looking for submarines, and not just U.S., different parts of the world. And then, get back there, convoy protection. You see the movie Greyhound with Tom Hanks? There's a scene in there where there's a German submarine that's lined up getting ready to torpedo Tom Hanks' ship, and a PBY appears out of nowhere, torpedoes the submarine, and saves the ship. In reality, they weren't very good torpedo planes. There were much better ones, but they could carry a torpedo. Anti-submarine warfare, this is where they really excelled. They could drop depth charges on submarines. They could also drop smoke bombs to mark where the submarine was. So a destroyer or a cruiser could come over and torpedo the guy, or hedgehogs.
So it would just be a buoy that would make smoke or something?
Pardon me?
Would it just be a buoy that would make smoke or something?
Just a smoke bomb. Smoke bomb.
It would float on the surface.
Would it float on the surface or just,
It just smoke as it went down.
oh,
Just so they could visually spot where the sub was. And then this was a development that was actually developed at the Salton Sea. It was called a magnetic anomaly detection system. And nobody but the scientists knew what an anomaly was, so later they changed it to magnetic airborne detection. But what it was is it could find a submarine by its magnetic image. But the problem was it didn't register until it was right over the submarine. Well, if you dropped a depth charge, the depth charge is going to have an arc from the forward momentum of the airplane. So they mounted a rocket on it that would offset the arc, so the thing would drop straight down. And that was, they equipped two different squadrons with this MAD detection system. One went to the Atlantic, one went to the Pacific. The one in the Pacific did a lot better than the one in the Atlantic because the Germans they changed their strategy. Instead of diving when they saw a PBY, they stayed on the surface and duke it out with their deck gun. And PBY is a really good target. It's big and it's low and it's slow. So, and once again, that was developed at the Salton Sea in collaboration with Caltech. Here's a torpedo attack. Like I said, torpedo attacks really didn't work out too well. I don't know whether that was because of the rotten Mark 13 torpedoes or the fact that it just wasn't a very good torpedo plane, but limited success with torpedoes. And bombing and harassment. This is the famous black cats. And I used to wonder, every time I saw one of these, they had a terrible paint job. And I thought, they must have got some really bad flat black paint. Well, it wasn't paint, it was lamp oil and soot. And they would darken these things so we couldn't see them at night. And they would sneak up on the Japanese, either Japanese shipping or Japanese accountment. They'd come in high and cut their engines off because, radial engines are too stealthy. And they glide in and then start dropping bombs. And it really freaked the Japanese. They thought we had some secret weapon until they figured it out. But there's quite a few YouTube videos on the black cats, and the History Channel did a special on them. But they created a lot of havoc in the Pacific. Gunboat was the Air Sea Rescue, and this was done by both the Navy and the Army Air Force. So they rescued flyers out at sea. The fighter pilots really had a lot of faith in that if they ran out of gas or they got shot down, PBY would be there to pick them up. And so they were very protective of the PBYs. You know, they might make fun of them by flying circles around them, but they often made sure nobody got close to them. And here you see one on the water. There's a rescue across there. By the way, the Army had, I think, 300 and something PBYs of their own, strictly for air sea rescue.
So, I'm sorry, so during that time, the person actually flying the plane is up in that pod?
No, he's not flying the plane, he's controlling the engine. It's a flight engineer. It's usually an enlisted man. And he's mixture, RPM, you know, all this stuff. And there's probably I don't have a picture of it, but there's on the control yokes, there's a light bar. And they would have a light system because, you know, he's not going to hear you say something. So that's how they communicated with the flight engineer, was by this light bar, and had toggle switches. So, you know, if they said, put the gear down, toggle switch. So,
And so he could indicate how much power, the pilot can say how much
Yeah.
power they want
Yeah.
through that?
I think the pilot actually can control the power, but the rest of the stuff.
Oh,
Did
okay.
they move those controls to the cockpit in the later versions?
I'm sorry?
Did they move those controls to the cockpit? You said they got rid of the flight engineer.
Yeah, when they put them in civilian use, that was the first thing they did. Was route everything to the pilot.
Okay.
The second thing they did was take the turret off. So towards the end of the war, they were mostly moving people around, especially officers. There was a PBY that hauled MacArthur's lame butt far away out of the Philippines. Nimitz was moved around a lot by PBYs. They weren't really good troop transport because they could only hold about 12, 15 people total. But if you needed a specialist somewhere, and you knew if you put him in a PBY, he'd get there because they could land on the water and they had 3,000-mile range, didn't need a runway. Same thing with emergency supplies and spare parts. PBY production. So the majority of PBYs were built in San Diego by Consolidated Aircraft. Towards the end of the war, they built PB6A, very small number, which incorporated the improvements that the Navy put into the PB5, and those were actually done in New Orleans because they couldn't stop production in San Diego. And then New Orleans turned 35. And then the Naval Aircraft Factory built 156 Nomads, or PBNs, in for Navy. Other countries built them. Canadian Vickers built 369. Boeing in Canada built 362. And interestingly enough, Russians purchased a license from Consolidated and built 138 before their factory was overrun by the Germans, and the Germans put them out of the PBY business. But they did build 138. What happened to those planes? Big mystery. I'd like to go to Russia someday and try to find out. So operators, different story. The Navy operated the most of them. The Army Air Force operated 337 for air sea rescue. The Commonwealth countries, Royal Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, Royal New Zealand Air Force, operated over 1,000 of them. And then some of the other countries, Netherlands, East Indies, or Dutch, operated quite a few. And even little old Chile had 3 of them.
I think somebody's locked out.
6 people.
Smokes, we're
We're
waiting
definitely
for you
gonna
guys.
put on the AC.
Did you guys move forward?
Funny?
We got some more people. Come on in.
Come on in, have a chair.
Actually, probably 6 people.
138 of them under license, and then toward the end of the war, we gave them another 48 little lease. Those were actually most of those were the PBMs that the Navy built.
Sid, can you talk a little bit about how the Army got involved with air sea rescue?
Well, yeah, because there were a lot of, like in the Pacific, there were a lot of Army pilots, a lot of, flying P-40s and such. And so they decided they needed their own air sea rescue. So
Okay, the Navy, yeah.
this is interesting. This is a lake in Dallas, Texas. And actually, my wife's daughter lives right near this lake, so I'm familiar with it. There's I try to count them, and I keep coming up with a different number every time. There's either 36 or 37 PBYs on that lake. They were being ferried from the west coast to the east coast to be given to other countries under the Lend-Lease program. So and this was very secret. Can you imagine having a house on the lake in Dallas and you wake up one morning and there's 36 or 37 PBYs there? Yeah.
Just like a lot of other planes where the women that flew them right from the factory to the distribution points.
Pardon me?
In World War II, a lot of the women, most of the women flew these planes, not that plane, but a lot of planes for when they were built.
Yeah, like
The distribution points, was that the same with the PBY? They were women to fly it in?
I don't know, probably. I don't recall any of the WASPs or even flying PBYs, so,
Okay.
because they were technically an Army organization, and this is Navy.
What lake is that?
Pardon me?
What's the name of the lake?
It's right in downtown Dallas.
Oh, I don't know where that- I don't know what that would be.
I'll ask my wife and then I'll tell you.
Yeah, I'm curious.
So they also built one civilian, actually two civilian PBYs. This was used by an explorer to do explore up the river in New Guinea. But the Russians lost their equivalent of Jacques Cousteau up in the Antarctic. So they begged for this airplane, and so the people that owned it sold it to the Russians, and then they built them another one. So there's a Guba and a Guba 2. So that's about the only two civilian PBYs that were actually never owned by the military. Post-war missions, a lot of the militaries that got them during the war kept them in action, as did we. A lot of them went into private airliners, especially in the island countries in the Pacific where they didn't have runways. So there's a movie with Frank Sinatra and I'll think of his name in a second, where it's called The Devil at 4 O'Clock. There's it's in the Pacific, a community is living on this island, it turns into a volcano and blows up. But there's actually a PBY that's ferrying people around these islands in that movie. It's kind of interesting. Spencer Tracy, Frank Sinatra and Spencer Tracy. They had a lot of cargo. In the 80s, when I used to drive from Mission Viejo to Rancho Dominguez, I drove by Long Beach Airport, and every morning there was a PBY that took cargo out to Catalina, and back and forth Long Beach to Catalina. Firefighting, like I said, a lot of them were used to fight fires, a lot of them massive corrosion due to all that water and chemicals. And then there was a company in the 50s that actually bought a bunch of surplus PBYs, and they created them as luxury for land yachts. Here's a PBY on a firefighting mission. And here's one of the land yachts. You see that it took the turret off first thing. And there was a man that took his wife and kids on a round the world trip. And he landed somewhere by Saudi Arabia, and there was a bunch of crazed Bedouins that, because it was painted blue and white, they thought it was an Israeli transport dropping commandos. So they opened up on it and put 300 bullet holes in it. And the wreck is still sitting on the beach as far as I know.
Whoa.
There's,
That's a disappointing vacation.
yeah. Actually, the man and his wife both got wounded, the kids didn't.
Oh, man.
But you can see here some of the 300 bullet holes. Imagine the tire looks in pretty good shape. And this is really interesting. This is the Bird Innovator, and Dr. Bird, amazing guy. I mean, we could talk an hour about him, but he sold it when he was 14. He had a PhD in engineering, and he got interested in how people breathe, and he went back and got an MD, so he's a doctor, and he used the PBY to go around and teach doctors how to use this medical equipment that he invented. And it had turboprops added. And this plane was actually based at Palm Springs in the 70s. So I don't know if any old timers, did you see it, Don?
Oh, yeah, I remember it was parked there, and that I recall it had brackets and a couple of bicycles hanging under the wing.
Could well be.
Yeah,
Could well be.
you know, they left them there in flight.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me, I forgot something. When they, the Dumbo missions, the Army ones, they would actually put life rafts under the wings. And so they could fly over a downed pilot, pull a cord and drop a life raft. I don't know if the Navy did that or not, but I know the Army did.
I think Dr. Bird was a member at the Springs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was at the Springs Club.
God. Well, he had a place up in Sandpoint, Idaho, where he had a museum and all kinds of, really interesting guy, just a genius. And this organization exists up in Eugene, Oregon. It's called Soaring by the Sea. And they take this PBY to air shows, and they give rides. And this is actually a Boeing-built Canadian PBY, but they refer to it as a PBY. They refer to it as a PBY. I got to ride in that thing from Eugene, Oregon to Spanish Forks, Utah, where there was an air show, and Frank was there, and that was a real kick. I actually got to fly it for 20 minutes. I didn't say I flew it well, but I did get to fly it. So that was my bucket list. I was actually going to go to Amsterdam to fly one there, but it got bought by the Collings Foundation, and when they wrecked their B-17 and killed people, the FAA jerked their air show permit. So I couldn't do that. The reason I was able to go to Amsterdam was because my wife got a river cruise out of the deal, but I saved money on that. Questions?
So what was it like to fly it?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'd always heard the controls are really hard because there's no hydraulic assist, but I found the controls weren't bad, but the rudder pedals, you had to stand on them to get that rudder to move. And if you look at how big that rudder is, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But other than that, yes, sir.
The fire bombers, were they super scoopers, or did they stop and fill up the tank and then take off again?
I know one that was a super scooper. It was actually operated by a moonlighting fire captain. It was painted red, and he was up out of the San Bernardino area, and he would scoop up. And he ended up crashing and killing himself. But that one was a super scooper. The rest of them, I don't know. I can't tell you.
Sid, did you ever hear that in the later years, maybe they turned some of those, the problem with the rudder having to stand on the rudder pedals, did they transition any of those stuff to hydraulics later?
They might have. I'm not aware of any.
I can't see, loading that thing that was heavy with water and all like that, and then having the pilot trying to stand on those things.
Or an engine?
Well, maybe it was me. You know, like I said, I didn't fly it well, but I flew it.
Yeah.
Is there another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, what's the actual size of this plane? Like, is there like a reference between like?
Oh boy,
It's huge.
it's
rather large.
it's huge.
Those pictures don't do it. I got to stand, he told me he went up there and I stood up next to it and I was flipping out how huge it
Well,
was.
Cliff has, work you do with the Army's, you know, B-17 and PBY. What's your comparison between those two?
I think the PBY might be just a little bit wider.
The wingspan wider?
Yeah. I mean, look in the back there, in the restoration area, that thing is like, it's our great shade provider.
Yeah.
In the middle of summer, I mean, we try to work under the wings of the PBY because it's high enough that we don't have to worry about it hitting it, and then.
Talk about working on them. They came equipped with these scaffold-like things that would hang on the wing, so they could actually do maintenance on it while it was in the water. But if you dropped your wrench, it was goodbye wrench.
And can you see the PBY from anywhere standing?
You can see it, yeah, if you come around the corner of the hangar, you'll see it back there.
Okay.
When do you think
Right
it might be done? We won't live
Sounded
that
like the
long.
rest of the management there. When's this gonna be done, when's Disney gonna be done?
Any question?
Yeah, Hobby King, they sell a PBY right now, a model, electric, and they have retractable tip floats and everything. It's like $427.
That's cool.
I almost bought one just to bring it here, but I figured no. But they have really, really cool airplanes. They've got differential throttle steering. I've got a Catalina, and I've got, a bunch of models that fly. We fly at Lake Hemet. Once a week we go up there and fly float. So I had an old PBY that was a E-Flight PBY, and it was electric, and it was the same thing. It didn't have the retractable tip float, so it had a tendency to snag a tip, snag a float,
Drop away.
embarrass you on takeoff.
I've got a PBY model that my friend built for me. It's about like that. John?
I flew with Danny Lynch up in Billings, Montana,
Yeah.
back in the early '70s, and he had his water scooper PBY. Matter of fact, it was the opening scene in some movie about firefighting. I can't think of the name of it, but the opening scene showed these two guys in a boat fishing.
Yes, that's,
And you
Yeah.
can see
what movie is that?
the airplane dropped down, scooping water, and just coming right toward him, and then it just barely clears him.
It's not
Anyway, that was
the
Danny
movie
Lynch
Always
in that movie.
with John Goodman, is it Always? The movie?
Could be always.
Is it always?
It is, that's it, that's it.
Yeah, right.
That's a good scene.
Any other questions?
The prize.
Yes.
So another reference to the size of the PBY is, its wingspan is 104 feet. The DC-3, which uses the same engines, has a wingspan of 95 feet, which is the same as the 737.
Wow. Yeah.
Somebody else had a question? Yes.
With the increased salinity of the Salton Sea, would anybody land a float plane on the Salton Sea?
Oh,
today?
yeah. They were, during the war, you look at San Diego Bay, and remember there's a big seaplane operation on North Island. The ramps are still there. But San Diego Bay was getting real busy in World War II, because you have the tuna fleet, and you have the military, and it's not that big. So they got these new PBY pilots, you don't want them running into stuff in San Diego. So they would go out to the Salton Sea and do touch and goes and whatever else. Everybody got trained, the gunners, the bombers, everybody was trained out there. And then they come back to San Diego. And sometimes, I've got a whole talk I give on the Salton Sea, but sometimes they would stay overnight. There was a resort out there that they would actually get their meals at. But it was a booming base. And then there's even some private float planes that landed at the Salton Sea. And they had one problem though, when there was no wind, the sea was like glass. They called them glass landings. And they couldn't really estimate the height. And a lot of times they'd slam on and they would pop rivets. So they'd always carry a bunch of sharpened pencils. And wherever a rivet popped, they'd stick the pencil in it until they could get back and have some say or put new rivets in it. So, yeah, it was a big operation at Salton Sea. Yes, sir.
Paul Tibbets, Colonel Tibbets, when he was doing the training for the Hiroshima bomb run, they would fly out of Wendover and they would drop, they had 4 different wood targets out there in the Salton Sea.
Yeah, they had 2 on the land and 2 in the water.
And
They would drop shapes.
10,000
called them
pound
shapes.
bombs, they were concrete bombs.
And then they perfected, they didn't, remember the first atomic bomb was the first atomic bomb. They didn't know what it would do. So they had an escape maneuver to get the airplane out of the blast wave. And they basically put it into a steep dive, turning at the same time to go away from the blast. So they perfected that out at the Salton Sea.
We had the daughter of the tail gunner on the Enola Gay, and he was out there, and she wrote a book, and he's the one that took all the pictures of the Hiroshima bomb mushroom cloud.
What's the name of the book?
God.
You think of it, let me know.
They're from Kingman, I know that. I'll find out though.
Okay.
I'll text Ray.
Any other questions?
What
Yeah.
years was the Salton Sea active with all that?
Basically from 41 on, and the Salton Sea was a naval training area from 41 to 45, and then after the war, the Atomic Energy Commission took it over, and they were contracting with Sandia Labs, and they eventually just gave it to Sandia Labs, and they continued what Paul Tibbets started with. They were testing nuclear bombs, not the bomb itself, but the container. And they had cameras and all kinds of interesting stuff where they actually track it down and see how it behaved. They were trying to come up with the most efficient shape for the atomic bomb. So, and that, also, the Navy used Salton Sea as an emergency seaplane landing area. Because if you're coming in from Hawaii or Corpus Christi or Jacksonville, Florida, and you're seaplane, and you're running out of gas, and San Diego goes under weather at 4 o'clock in the afternoon like it likes to do, what are you gonna do? You know, so they would actually go out to the Salton Sea and land there and wait for the weather to clear in San Diego. So,
Just like this airport, right?
pardon me?
That's what this airport did too, when they got socked in, they'd land here and stay here, right?
Yeah, in Palm Springs. That's how Palm Springs Airport really got its name, from the airliners. When they got under weather, they'd have to land in Palm Springs. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I've heard, that military training, there's inevitably accidents, and I've heard there's as many as maybe 60 or 70 military aircraft in the Salton Sea.
There's a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Most of them are Avengers. And in fact, in 2000 and something, they were looking for a man and his wife that went down in a Cherokee. And they didn't find the Cherokee, but they found an Avenger. And there was pictures of it in the LA Times. But there's, I don't know the exact number because the Navy planes are accounted for, but there was also a couple of Marine Corps planes and a couple of Army planes that went in. Because the Salton Sea had the only skid bomb target in the southwest United States. So planes would fly in from all over to practice skip bombing. So if you ever saw the movie Dam Busters where they, yeah, that was one of the bombing techniques they were perfecting. But that was the only target, was at the Salton Sea.
And there's a structure that I see when I'm flying that's still down kind of towards South Shore. Is that one of the old targets?
That was a bomb target that was built by the Atomic Energy Commission. And you look at it, it looks like a chain link fence, but it's what they call radar rigging. So the target would show up on radar. And that is now there's a weather station on it, but there's like 4 different entities that get data off that thing. And the whole thing's covered in bird poop now. Poop and mess, you know. So when there was good fishing in the Salton Sea, there was really good fishing around that thing. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you.